curious, how common are heart transplants for pediatric cases? Like, I can't imagine that there are more available than with adults. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think the question was how common are pediatric heart transplants? Pediatric heart donors, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you're absolutely right. It's a relatively rare thing. Like, if you look at all medical conditions for children, heart failure is pretty rare. And even within all children that have heart failure, it's even rare to progress to a point where you need a heart transplant. Put it in perspective, we at DC Children's, and we're a pretty big hospital. We did, I don't want to make this up, I think we did 13 or 14 pediatric heart transplants last year. So about one a month in our center. If you extrapolate that out, that's maybe, so maybe 50 a month in the U.S., so maybe, what's that, like 600 a year in the United States? So it's pretty rare, very rare. Unfortunately, for every kid that gets transplanted, there's probably several that unfortunately pass away while they're waiting for a heart transplant.
Thank you.
So you might have said it, but what was the diameter of the prosthetic mitral valve?
The mitral valve that I showed you? Yeah, so that's the one that I showed you is a St. Jude mitral valve, and it's the smallest one they make is 19 millimeters.
19 millimeters?
19,
19.
Yep.
Wow.
So that's the smallest one that they make. And again, I don't know if you guys have like nieces, nephews, or cousins who are that little, who are 2 years old, or if you've been around a 2-year-old baby lately, but like your heart's as big as your fist, and so picture a 2-year-old fist. It's pretty small. It's a pretty big size mismatch. So they end up, if they have to put a 19 millimeter valve into a smaller kid, they have to put it in what's called the superannular position. So it ends up hanging out kind of like a third of the way up into the left atrium in order to fit in the heart. It's a accepted surgical technique.
So when would that need to be replaced? I mean, you mentioned they can last 15 to 20 years, but if you're talking about like a 70 or 80-year-old patient, that's a different story than if, I assume they have to be replaced at some point.
Yeah, so in a 2-year-old, I mean, you'd be lucky to get them to age 10, I think, just because of growth reasons.
Right.
The kids can really, everyone with a prosthetic mitral valve has a little bit of ingrowth of tissue around that, that white annulus. It's actually, that's like spongy. So it can hold suture. That's how they sew it in. So around that kind of spongy white, sorry, there's ambulances outside. I don't know if you can hear them or not, sorry. But around that annulus, you can get normal ingrowth of like normal fibrous tissue. And that's what starts, over time, those leaflets don't close all the way. They kind of like tilt up a little bit on that tissue, and the valves can leak more, and that's a frequent cause of valve failure, and just leak over time. And then sometimes the valve leaflets don't open all the way either. So yeah, if you put one in a 2-year-old, I would hope to get them to age 10, and then once you get them in a 10-year-old, that's when it's like you could probably put more of like a 15-year or hopefully a 20-year type of life of the valve. But with everything I showed you, it's going to be constant. There's no like one curative surgery. It's usually like just a matter of time resetting the clock until the next procedure that patient needs. Were there other questions about any of the devices or any of the components of training of medicine?
So those valves you're talking about with where the leaflets are hand sewn, how can you process something like that if like hand sewing is not really standardized?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I've often wondered the same thing. I mean, they must make them, there are ways, I think, to standardize the manufacturer and evaluate, like QA, the specimens and stuff before you package them and ship them. I'm definitely not a specialist in this area. But there are, it's funny, I have a friend at University of Maryland in a biomedical engineering department. He's actually, his work is in robotics. This company actually had maybe checked in with him to see if there was any like robotic way to create this anastomosis, to create the sutures around the struts of this stent, because right now the best they could do was the hand sewing. And I don't know if they make dyes or if there's like a QA process or something, but I've wondered the same thing, and I'm not sure. It's a good question. But I mean, to this day, I believe they're hand sewn. Like tomorrow, someone's going to go to the area where these are created and hand sew in a bunch of leaflets. Like I think that's their current best solution.
Yeah, there's a when I worked in industry, we had one of the products that the company I worked at made were these micro valves, replacement valves, and the pyrolytic carbon ones like you showed, and it was the same. It was back then. That was how they got the annulus on there, the Dacron annulus. They actually had a finishing step that was hand sewn. So the
really?
The main components were machined, but then to put the Dacron sleeve sewing ring around on it, then the final step was hand sewn. So you had these groups of people in a clean room under with microscopes who would do that finishing step. And I think you're right. I think it's really built into the QC process to like look at them, and then they're released if they meet certain QC criteria. But yeah, it's kind of amazing that you can do that, and that people can sit and do that all day long. That's very arduous manual work.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I know. It's kind of like a surgeon's. That's like a surgical level skill. Like most people go to medical school and become surgeons.
Right. No,
it's incredible. Incredible dexterity, I'm sure, that they have.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really interesting the way it's developed. I didn't know that, Marcia, about the valves that you had worked on.
Yeah, that may not be true anymore, but I mean, because this was a long time ago that I was working at that company. But it's interesting that the whole concept of developing a robotic or an automated process for that. This also sounds like kind of an interesting problem, or an interesting technological challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so funny. My friend was like kind of, I don't know, casual conversation, but it might have been more than casual conversation, with this company that was basically like looking to get into a more, I guess, a different level of manufacturing, but hadn't been able to figure it out yet. Which is interesting.
Good question.
Do you guys do a separate, if I remember from last year, you guys do a separate, or you have a whole separate curriculum about the FDA, right? About,
yes. Yep.
Working with the FDA and.
Yeah, there's a course on FDA regulations, just kind of learning the FDA regulations, what they are, and how they affect medical device design, or how they impact medical device design. And then there's a separate course. We actually have a new course the last 3 years that's called Medical Device Design Controls, and it's taught by an alum who has been in the medical device industry for 13 years, and that's what she does. She does quality control and design for medical devices, and so she kind of takes the class through a project where they have to apply the regulations. Head nods. I think some folks in the room are either in the class or taking the class. So,
great.
Yeah, so really trying to bring that in and integrate that.
That's awesome. That's incredible, and what a special treat. It sounds like that is. It's so funny. I'm on a team, obviously, but it's funny, our team is getting closer and closer to like an application for FDA approval, and the whole process is so unbelievably complex. You guys probably know better than me, but that's been a really interesting part of all this.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm just looking.
Well, yeah.
I'm just looking at my battery, so my technological challenges continue. I actually ordered a new one because my battery life has been so bad, and of course I forgot. So just in case we cut out, that's the reason. So I'm going to apologize in advance, but we maybe have time for one more question. All right. Well, I have one more. Sorry, I have one more because it always makes me infinitely curious. So if for somebody who's working with, so you mentioned like there's a really cool this stethoscope project that you're talking about, and like you've got some really cool ideas. When you have a cardiologist or someone in your position who wants to work with a biomedical engineer, what's that process like? I mean, if you're don't have the training in biomedical engineering like you or some of your colleagues that you've described.
Yeah, so I imagine it's a little different everywhere. We are really fortunate to be, academically affiliated with GW, and we have colleagues who are also affiliated with GW. But it's interesting, Marcia. Everyone's offices are here at Children's National, and so we have this Institute for Surgical Innovation, where there are scientists like on the 6th floor of the hospital. We all take care of our patients on floors 1 through 4, and so we can basically each group knows the other ones there, and there are many, like there's some mature connections, there's some new connections, and so it's kind of here how it works is it's kind of word of mouth where my colleague Robin had this idea about a stethoscope, and they just hired this guy who does advanced algorithms and data assessment, and so they get together. Maybe they weren't the right match, but he knows someone else, and so it's kind of like this word of mouth situation where the people who've been around a while are trying to hook up the newer people and create collaborations. I think it's really important, like from a top-down perspective, leadership of the hospital, both of the technical, of the Surgical Innovation Institute, as well as of the clinical side of the hospital. Both leadership of both sides are heavily supportive of collaboration. And we have a whole office here called the Tech Transfer Office. I'm sure you probably have a huge Tech Transfer Office there. So that's their job, is to help us spin off ideas and companies and create patents and that whole process. Because doctors are really bad at that stuff.
We're also really busy and have a very, very specific life and death kind of priority in terms of your work too. So one of the goals of this class is to talk to people who are different clinical settings, and get advice and sort of bring the clinician into the classroom, because that's such an important interaction. It sounds like something you have very well integrated into the facility that you're in, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it is. And again, I think it's really a leadership. It's like a top-down thing where our leaders are interested in that, and so it makes it easier for us to do.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we're going to say goodbye, and thank you very much. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Have a great weekend, and happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, you too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.